So, good evening, everyone. This is my fourth webinar in this series. So, the fourth and the last. I'm kind of sad because now I feel warmed up. The first one, I was like, oh my God, I'm so nervous. And I was like, I wore this headset and I didn't like the way it made my hair look. But now I'm just so comfortable and I'm really sad that this is the last one. But I hope you can catch some of the other ones. So tonight's topic is called Conscious Conversations, Embracing Anti-Racism in Practice. Throughout this presentation, you can feel free to use the chat feature, or you can just literally unmute and talk at me. I'm very informal, but I have a lot to say, so I'm just gonna be going on and on and on. So feel free to interrupt me. For this series, I have used a Afro beats, kind of us grounding in and just starting off. And so I'm gonna start with that. So this is our fourth song, and I'll kind of explain if you haven't caught any of these other webinars, like what the meaning is.
Just like pearls, best thing in the world. Never trade you for anybody else. And a brown skin girl, your skin just like pearls, the best thing in the world. I never trade you for anybody else. Singing.
She says she really grew up poor like me. Don't believe in nothing but the Almighty. Just a little jeans and a pure whitey. She never dream forever be nobody wifey. Yeah. She well, I mean a pretty but your heart is a miss. Play you like a villain cause she caught in a way. Tonight I am walking away. 9 to 5 mind and a grind. Tonight I might fall in love, depending on how you hold me. I'm glad that I'm calming down. Can't let no one come control me. Keep dancing and call it love. She fights it by falling slowly. If ever you are in doubt, remember what mama told me. Brown skin girl, your skin just like pearls. Your back against the world. I never trade you for anybody else. A brown skin girl, your skin just like pearls. The best thing in all the world. I never trade you for anybody else.
And now, introducing the debutantes and their bows.
Like a trophy when Naomi's walking. She need an Oscar for that pretty dark skin. Pretty like Lupita when the camera's closing. Drip broke the levee when my Kelly's rolling. I think tonight she might braid her braids. Melanin too dark to throw her shade. She minds her business and winds her waist. Go like 24K. Okay.
Tonight I might fall in love, depending on how you hold me. I'm glad that I'm calming down. Can't let no one come control me. Keep dancing and call it love. She fighting but falling slowly. If ever you are in doubt, remember what mama told me. Brown skin girl, your skin just like pearls. Your back against the world. I never trade you for anybody else. A brown skin girl, just like pearls. The best thing about the world. I never tried you for anybody else.
Oh, have you looked in the mirror lately?
I would love to listen to the whole song, but for the sake of time, I just wanted to give you a little piece. So that is the fourth song in the Afro Beats playlist for this webinar series. So the first week we talked about cultural humility and the song was Essence by Wizkid. The second week we talked about cultural responsiveness and the song was Art, and I used an ART acronym to talk about cultural responsiveness and assessment and treatment. The third session, we talked about therapeutic relationships. And so we used A Piece of My Heart by Wizkid. Can you tell I really like Wizkid? And finally, Anti-Racism Brown Skin Girl by Beyonce, Blue Ivy, St. John, and Wizkid. And so this song has received many awards. It is from the 2019 Lion King, The Gift soundtrack album. And why is celebrating Blackness, because that's what this song celebrates, anti-racist? The best answer I have for you is from a spoken word from Tina Lawson, the mother of Beyonce. And it says, I think a part of it is accepting that it's so much beauty in being Black. And that's the thing that I guess I get emotional about because I've always known that. I've always been proud to be Black, never wanted to be nothing else, loved everything about it. Just, it's such beauty in Black people. And it really saddens me that we're not allowed to express that pride in being Black, and that if you do, then it's considered anti-white. No, you're just pro-Black, and that's okay. The two don't go together. So in our presentation today, we are celebrating Blackness because the premise of racism is anti-Blackness. So that is why we started with that song and the final song in our playlist. So let's get it going here. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge the land wherever you are. If we can just take a moment to acknowledge the land that you are on, the many enslaved and indentured people who have been forced to dedicate their labor to the construction of what is America today. And where I am is in Charlotte, North Carolina, Mecklenburg County. So I just want to take a moment for this land acknowledgement. Really quickly, my disclosures. I am a visiting associate clinical professor at Northeastern University Charlotte campus. I am receiving an honorarium for this webinar this evening. I am a proud board member of the National Black Association of Speech, Language, and Hearing and a member of ASHA Special Interest Group SIG 14. So a little bit about me. I'm so glad that you all are here tonight. This is low-key a packed Zoom room, in my opinion, because you could be doing lots of other things. So I really appreciate all of you being here. Like I said, I'm Dr. Danny Scott. I am from Savannah, Georgia. I'm currently living in Charlotte. I have been in academia for about 4.5 years, and I've been a speech therapist. This is actually next month this month is my 10-year anniversary of being a SLP. So that is so exciting. I have lots of subject matter expertise in the area of anti-racism, including I was a racial equity advocate at my last institution, Minnesota State University, Mankato, for 3 years. I have taken a graduate course, Harvard, Bravely Confronting Racism in Higher Education. I've also been a part of the CAPSID DEI Academy, and I have taken training in Courageous Conversations About Race, just to name a few. I'm going to be, I believe in my the Google Docs, there is at least one publication of mine. I will be referencing a publication from Embasla Resound, which is our magazine publication. I'll be talking a little bit about that later. In the spirit of self-reflexivity, I want to begin with my positionality. I am a dark-skinned Black American cisgender heterosexual Christian woman, a descendant of enslaved African people. I have earned a doctorate. I am middle class, non-disabled, monolingual, bidialectal, a speech language practitioner, psychologist, and professor. I am a daughter, I'm a sister, I'm a friend, and my core values are love, faith, hope, and justice. For our learning objectives today, we are first going to define anti-racism and define anti-racism and distinguish it from not racist. Then we are going to explain socially constructed racism and anti-Blackness as a social determinant of health. And you will leave here with, I hope, 5 practical strategies for enacting your anti-racism journey. So in our flow for today, we have always kind of had the same flow. We're going to go through the topic areas, but first we will start with a grounding. And a grounding is just a mindfulness exercise to center our thoughts, excuse my typo, on the topic of anti-racism for today. So
Brad Edwards was preparing to welcome his first.
Sorry. Okay, I guess it's gonna start automatically. Okay, so we're gonna go right into this clip and there is a question for you to reflect after the clip is over.
Brad Edwards was preparing to welcome his first children, twin boys, into the world in 2017 with his then girlfriend. Both babies died due to complications in childbirth. In his grief, he connected with longtime friend Kyra Betts, who happens to be a doula. A doula is a trained professional who provides non-medical, emotional, and physical support to birthing people before, during, and after childbirth. Betts and Edwards launched the first of several 6-week training programs in St. Louis, Missouri, through the nonprofit Fearless Fathers.
I'm going to be a first-time dad coming up sometime next year. Well, my primary reason for being here is just to soak up as much knowledge as I can because I'm very nervous.
The need in the Black community is high. Black women are 3 times more likely to die in childbirth compared to their white counterparts, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. During the 6-week course, men go through real-life medical scenarios. Edwards hopes his program, and others like it, will encourage men to reframe a father's role in the birthing and delivery process.
I know in my father's generation, we'll go in the parking lot, we'll smoke a cigar, we'll have a drink. But my thing to men now is, you don't know if you go out to that parking lot that there'll be a child to hold in that delivery room, or if there'll be a mother to hug and kiss and celebrate with.
Okay, so maybe you have heard of Dad's to-do list from social media. I was very intrigued with that story. So do you think anyone can feel free to answer? You can unmute, you can put your response in the chat. Do you think Dad's to-do list is racist or anti-racist? And while you might say, well, that seems like an obvious answer, if you look in the media today, if you pay attention to any politics or things that are being banned, this is actually a legitimate question. So is this movement, what this man has started, Dad's to-do list, would you consider that racist or anti-racist, and why?
Let's see, there's a hand
Robin, you have a hand up. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think anything that we're doing to try to survive, I see it as more of a survival program, right? And like the Black Panthers survival pending revolution. And so it may not necessarily fit into an anti-racist program, but by surviving, it is anti-racist, right? It is pro-Black, which is not, which is in and of itself an anti-racist thing. And so, yeah, and so the other thing that I was going to say about that is, the way that is framed is a false equivalence of racism when we're talking about the society, and it's always been arranged as this zero-sum game, right? And so if in any way people who are oppressed gain any sort of freedom, of justice, then it is framed as taking away from whites, the dominant European culture.
Mm-hmm. And I love that you said anything that's pro-Black is anti-racist, because it is. And we're going to talk about what these definitions are. But it's so interesting that when you talk about doing something positive for the Black community, conversations can be, well, what about everyone else? What about other people? And I didn't make up the definition of racism. I mean, why would I? It harms me, right? So this is the definition of racism is what we'll talk about. How is this even constructed? Under what premise? Under what idea? And then what does anti-racism look like? And we'll talk about how anti-racism is an active process. So thank you, Robin, for sharing, and thank you for coming tonight. Is race a social determinant of health? Why or why not? Is race a social determinant of health? Any guesses? What do you think? So we're going to talk about this in the middle section of this presentation. Oh, yes. Mr. Jackson, would you like to answer or bring your voice into the space?
Sure, good evening. Sorry, my camera's not on.
Oh, you're-
I know it's not listed officially as one of the social determinants, but yes, it is, because if we link it to some of what's listed there, employment, income, housing, childhood care, relationships, social inclusion, all of those things have an impact depending upon your race or your identity or the intersections of those. So while it's not officially part of the definition, it absolutely would be a social determinant of your health, as it has very correlated outcomes from my perspective.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. And Robin also said yes in the chat. And maybe it is listed, because I remember in 2020 when we were having this conversation about racism being a public health crisis. Well, it is. And so this is kind of a trick question, in the sense of race does not determine your health outcomes, but racism does. And so racism is the problem that we are trying to deconstruct. And racism, systemic, structural, the belief system of racism is what is causing people of color to have exponentially worse outcomes in their health and in their quality of life. And so we'll talk about racism as a social determinant of health. And the reason why I'm making the distinction is it is not something inherent to people of color that is causing them to have outcomes. So these beliefs like, well, Black people are more likely to get diabetes, it must be their blood. Literally no. So we're going to talk about some of those ideologies that have been carried on that really add to that. Nobody's free till everybody's free. I want you to, hopefully by the end of this presentation, I want you to see the connection. Not only our liberation is connection, so it is not only the work or the benefit of people of color, of Black people for anti-racism efforts, but it benefits all of us because our liberation is connected. And so I hope by the end of the presentation, you will even start to see a connection between diversity, equity, inclusion, woke, Black, racism, oppression, slavery, capitalism, incarceration, healthcare, because all those things are being very much under attack. All of these terms are being under the attack, and really it is not about the terms, it's not about the words, it's more so about people and ideas and a culture of disconnection and fear. So let's get into, I would say the most important part today is the definitions, because I think the first step to anti-racism is getting clarity on what race is and what it is not. So what is race? Race is a grouping of people based on shared physical characteristics such as skin color. Biologically, there isn't much difference between race groups, but there are significant variations of people within the same race. So there is more difference between people within this same group biologically than not in the same group. According to the executive board of the American Anthropological Association, genetic analysis shows that human populations are not unambiguous, clearly demarcated, biologically distinct groups, and that there is greater variation within racial groups than between them. So what does that mean? Race is not biologically based. Race is human made. Race is a very real experience for people of color and for white people. It is socially constructed. So why is this significant for speech language pathologists? Race is typically a salient identity marker for clients of color, which has implication on communication experiences and therapeutic relationships. I cannot say enough that you cannot separate someone's language experiences from their racial experiences. Also, a client's race is more predictive of special education status than other aspects of risk. Did y'all know that? Language and dialect is often used as a proxy for race. Culture is also used as a proxy for race. So we use those words when really we are talking about race. Racism, ableism, and capitalism are intertwined aspects related to equity in our assessment processes. So that leads me to the next definition. So we
Danny?
know that, yes.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Yeah, some comments and clapping about these distinctions. Robin has her hand up, and I just didn't know if this was from before.
Ooh.
A new comment or question.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I think I was trying to clap at one point. Sorry.
Oh, oh, it's
Sorry.
okay.
No
Yes,
worries.
please interrupt me. I don't mind it at all because you see, I'm just gonna keep going. I'm barely looking. I'm trying to read all these in between. So please feel free to
It's
jump
great.
right in. So the next definition is racism. So race is a socially constructed term that we are using to create demarcations and lines between people, to separate people. Okay, so what is racism? Racism is ongoing violent systems of exclusion based on the socially constructed category of race, handed down through histories of oppression and reproduced daily through conscious and unconscious interactions. Racism can be enacted on multiple levels simultaneously: institutional, cultural, interpersonal, and individual. Although a lot of times when we hear the word racism, we are thinking individual, but it is far beyond individual. That is only one type. Foundational histories of oppression include slavery, segregation, land dispossession, ethnic cleansing, various contexts of civic exclusion, as well as colonization. Racism is any prejudice against someone because of their race when those views are reinforced by systems of power. And that definition is from Dr. Uluo. She has an amazing book called So You Want to Talk About Race. So there has to be that reinforced system of power in order for it to be racist. If it is not, then it is prejudiced, okay? The significance for SLPs. Number one, institutional racism permeates the environments and the systems where we operate, which is healthcare and education. Racism significantly and directly impacts our clients, our patients, our students' ability to access quality services and quality education and achieve their desired communication outcomes. Racism impacts the extent to which effective communication is a human right, accessible and achievable for all. That is the vision of the American Speech Language Hearing Association. And racism is not only individual prejudice, it's systemic, interpersonal, internalized, structural, and institutional. So I have two visuals that kind of show you that. I'm going to go quickly through them because they are also in the handout. There is one on structural racism that just talks about what exactly that is, to have racism permeate structures, and some examples of that, such as discrimination in the housing market, redlining. And then the second visual has to do with those areas of racism, like internalized racism, such as implicit bias, interpersonal racism, such as microaggressions, racial microaggressions, such as, oh, you're so articulate. For a Black person. Institutional racism, bias policies and practices, and structural racism, which is in our systems, our societal systems that advantage and disadvantage people. What is the culture of racism? Racism is not just structural, institutional, it is a culture, and quite frankly, it is almost synonymous with American culture because race is a huge deal in this country. In fact, if you talk to anyone that is not from America, they will say, y'all got a serious problem with race, because we do. What is the culture of racism? The culture of racism is whiteness. Whiteness and white racialized identity refer to the way that white people, their customs, culture, language, and beliefs operate as the standard by which all other groups are compared. Whiteness is also at the core of understanding race in America. Whiteness and the normalization of white racial identity throughout America's history has created a culture where non-white people are seen as inferior or abnormal. White dominant culture also operates as a social mechanism that grants advantages to white people, since they can navigate society by feeling normal and being viewed as normal. An example of that is that if you ask a white person to describe their culture or to describe themselves as a cultural being, it is very hard for them to do. And that is not because something is wrong with them. It is because we live in a society where they are the dominant culture. So you feel like your culture is so normal, you don't even have one. People who identify as white rarely have to think about their racial identity because they live within a culture where whiteness has been normalized. One of my favorite activities I used to do when I started, when I would teach my culturally responsive practices course at the graduate level, is we would do some speed dating, and it would be on racial experiences. And the majority of the students in the program were white students. And so having them think about, what was your first experience with race and racism, and when exactly did you know about your race? And it would always be that the students of color had very early memories of this, and the white students not as much. And that is because whiteness is a culture that is highly normalized. Whiteness does not mean white people. So even if you are a white person and you hear that terminology, it's not personal. It is a culture. And in fact, we can all carry whiteness and be complicit in upholding whiteness personally and professionally. An example of that is me. I can carry whiteness being someone that works in academia, the way that I view time, the way that perfectionism is literally in my bones, and I have to try to uproot it every day. So whiteness is a cultural ideology. Why is this significant for us as speech language pathologists? Because CSD is predominantly a white field led by white researchers, white administrators, and white practitioners who develop and utilize knowledge developed for white clients. So we have our work cut out for us when it comes to anti-racism. how does racism show up in schools? I wanted to give you an example. So in our field, here are some examples. Anti-Black linguistic racism and the disproportionate representation of African American English speakers within the speech impairment eligibility category. At this point, it's been going on so long, we cannot say, oh, we just need to get better training. It's not about training. It is a form of racism, structurally, systemically, and in our beliefs. Prioritizing norm-based standardized assessments that are unable to illuminate the ethnic ways of knowing and non-mainstream linguistic strengths of culturally and linguistically diverse populations. Excluding culturally representative materials in therapy and limiting heritage language use or translanguaging in therapy. Low expectations for students of color with disabilities and cognitive referencing. Deficit ideologies and power imbalances around multilingualism, accents, non-mainstream dialects, and multimodal languaging. And finally, funneling Black and Brown students with cognitive communication disorders into the school to confinement pipeline. I talk all about this in my article called 70 Years After Brown versus Board of Education in the National Black Association publication Resound, and I'd be happy to share that with you. So thinking about what the culture of racism is, which is whiteness, what is the premise of racism? The premise of racism, meaning there would be no racism unless there is polarity. Polarity means opposites, okay? And those opposites are whiteness and anti-Blackness. In order for racism to be upheld, there has to be the underlying premise of anti-Blackness. And that forms the culture of white supremacy. White supremacy is systemic, political, economic, and it's cultural. It is conscious and unconscious, and it is ideas of white superiority in every way. So anti-Blackness is that polar opposite, which not the polar opposite, but anti-Blackness aligns with that because it is the inability to see the humanity of Black people. That is the definition of anti-Blackness. How is anti-Blackness different from racism? Because it is the disproportionate and specific racism towards people of African descent, particularly which that is embedded in colorism. So also, in order for racism to work, there has to be colorism, which is why even communities of color are divided and disconnected by colorism. Even the Black community is divided and disconnected by colorism. And that is the premise of racism. Why is this significant for us as SLPs? Because within our scope and ethics to develop our awareness and disrupt the harmful, toxic culture of white supremacy, that is within our scope. So individualism, perfectionism, power hoarding, those are things that are toxic and a part of white supremacy culture that we should uproot in order to connect, and foster inclusion and belonging, because the premise of white supremacy culture is disconnection in all forms. Also within our scopes, we have to be vigilant to uproot anti-Blackness in our policies and practices, learning from the experiences of our Black clients and colleagues of all intersectionalities and disrupting systemic disproportionalities, such as the misdiagnosis of African American English speakers and multilingual speakers in the school to confinement pipeline. We do not have the luxury of dismissing the systemic experiences of our clients, calling it political or outside of our scope of practice. So I hope I have convinced you that it is in our scope of practice. And finally, the definition of anti-racism, which is working actively to identify, resist, and eliminate racism, both formally and informally, and in everyday social interactions. Such work may include resistance within one's affinity groups and within historically white institutions in order to change racist systems, organizational structures, policies, practices, and attitudes so that resources and social power can be redistributed and shared equitably. Love that definition because it's so comprehensive. So the difference between passive, not racist, and active, anti-racist is in the name. There is no such thing as not racist. So not racist or saying you are not racist doesn't help the problem. And the heartbeat of racism is denial. So when we don't want to acknowledge racism, you can easily say, well, I'm not racist, because that doesn't do anything. So we need to eliminate that concept from our vocabulary because it means nothing. What means something is anti-racism, and it is active. The heart of anti-racism is confession, and that is confessing at individual acts of racism and the presence of systemic racism. And the transformative concept of anti-racism is going to help us to clearly recognize and take responsibility for prejudices, for power imbalances that are in our policies, in our environments, in our workplaces, and in our personal beliefs, and using that awareness and replacing it with love. So why is that significant for us as SLPs? Because anti-racism is an active process, and hopefully today we will commit to the journey. Yes, I love that too, and Dr. Ibram Kendi talks about that in his definition of anti-racism in the book, How to Be Anti-Racist. Great book. BT Dubs, I got a lot of book recommendations for y'all. This is in the handout too, so don't worry if I go really fast. These books I would say are like top of head when I think about my own anti-racism journey and the teaching that I have engaged in this area. Books that I think would be great for you as SLPs. Thank you for that message. Yes, Frantz Fanon, I really need to read that book. I read it in college, actually. The Wretched of the Earth. I read that in college, and I probably need to reread it. Okay, so before we go on, because I'm going to do a quick little review of the other topics we hit on and tying it into racism, does anyone have any comments or questions around those definitions? I know I have to move so fast to give you all this information.
Looks like Robin might.
Hi, Danny. Thank you. I put that message in just for you because it was so long, but I did want to kind of pull something out of that, it's definitely, racism, white supremacy are definitely embedded in this country and inherent, intrinsic to this country. I think I said inherent, but intrinsic to this, country. It is also, when we think about it, like the creation, like these social constructs, this creation of Europeanism, pan-whiteness, all of those, like anywhere that Africans were taken and like in the Caribbean and Brazil, Colombia, even Mexico, we have the same outcomes. We have the same outcomes anywhere in the world that we are. And it's also darker skinned Indians, right? Like everyone, there is this because of that project, anyone who is Black or the Blackest have the worst outcomes. And so
absolutely,
just wanted to throw that in, that it's not just here. And sometimes there's that, folks deny it in like France and Britain, but when you talk to folks in Mali or Burkina Faso, they're like, France is terrible. So
absolutely. And it is a worldwide phenomenon. And I think slavery was so foundational to that, transatlantic slave trade. And just to go back to what you're saying about colorism, that's why I really highly recommend that book, Caste, because I think it just has more of that world perspective on racism and colorism and all those things, because it's beyond that. It is a caste system if you look at these demarcations at a world level. And they have a movie for it too, and it's beautiful. So I do challenge you to watch it. Of course, it's beautiful, but very uncomfortable, obviously. But the learning that you will get, I think, can be very rich. So thank you for sharing that, Robin. Okay, and I got a little, it was a
One
thumbs
more.
up from one more,
Oh
okay?
yeah, yeah. Yep, lots of thumbs up and hearts.
Thank you.
One more in the chat. I appreciate having them in writing to be able to reflect upon the definitions. Yes, let's be active anti-racist.
Active is key, absolutely. So I'm gonna quickly go over just a quick review of what we have been talking about in this webinar series to kind of tie it all together. So in my first talk, I talked about the pillars of cultural humility, and I'm gonna go back over that using a lens of anti-racism. Then we talked about the equality, equity, reality, liberation, and thinking about those justice-centered frameworks like cultural humility, social justice, anti-racism, and the highest place would be liberation and freedom for all of us. We talked about cultural responsiveness as being the active process and the practical, I would say, step where we are taking our clients' cultural beliefs, values, perspectives into consideration in all aspects of education, being mindful that race is typically a very strong or salient cultural identity. Then I showed you all my cultural humility mind map that is in my article, Keeping It Real with Cultural Humility and Therapeutic Relationships. And I talked about how the research showed that cultural humility and rapport building are essential ingredients for building therapeutic relationships. So how would we look at the definition of cultural humility or the pillars of cultural humility using a lens of anti-racism? Well, and cultural humility is a lifelong process of critical self-reflection and critique on what? Our racial biases and belief systems, which include anti-Blackness, racial complicity, racial privilege, and or internalized racism and racial identity development. Those are great areas to engage in self-reflection. Second pillar, redressing racial power imbalances in the provider patient dynamic. So thinking about things like colorism and these demarcations in terms of white supremacy culture and being complicit in that. Also developing mutually beneficial partnerships with racially marginalized communities, especially Black communities, because as we talked about, that premise of racism is anti-Blackness. And finally, advocating and maintaining institutional accountability for what? For anti-racism, which is the active process of identifying, resisting, and eliminating racism. So institutional accountability, if we think about that perspective of cultural humility, we want to think about how can we address anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism as a social determinant of health. Health equity is a state in which we can all attain the highest level of health. So when it comes to social determinants of health, these are going to be conditions in your environment, such as social, political, physical, economic environment, where you live, where you learn, where you work, where you play. And guess what? Your racism is going to be a social determinant of health because it impacts those things. What does that look like? Anti-Black racism is a societal disease that synergistically oppresses and marginalizes Black populations, compromising their health in conjunction with various conditions present within and across health systems. Anti-Black racism is the complex health implications of racism. They've been documented for a very long time, but if we don't recognize them and we don't create response paradigms, they will continue. Health-related organizations have used anti-Black racism as a tool to advance white supremacy. One big example of that is a 2016 study, and I can say that almost 10 years later, this has not changed. A 2016 study found that many white medical students wrongly believe Black people have a higher pain tolerance than white people. Beliefs include that Black people have thicker skin and are less sensitive nerve endings or stronger immune systems. And that ideology, that harmful ideology, is one of the reasons why we have so many disparate health outcomes for Black communities. What are the barriers when it comes to racism being a social determinant of health? Not only having a lack of access to health coverage, especially if you think about systemic racism, economic advancement, and racism and how that all goes together. Access to medical centers, because in many Black communities and marginalized communities, they are medical deserts. And the only hospital or the only place you have to go is the free place that's always packed, and they don't have enough people. Distrust in healthcare systems. If you have ever experienced distrust from a client because of your race and the difference between your race and theirs, they have every right to not trust you. Our Black clients have every right not to trust the healthcare system and the educational system. Our racially marginalized clients have a right not to trust us, and we have to work to gain their trust in research and in the medical system and in the educational system. Also, there is a lack of access to same race physicians and anti-racist physicians. Even if you can't find someone in your same race, someone who has a track record of being anti-racist. And then finally, implicit racial bias in healthcare providers, in those attitudes and environments and belief systems. So I want us to close. We got 10 minutes, so I'm gonna try to get through these points. I want us to close with some strategies. I would say these are really just things for you to think about as you seek to go on a journey of active anti-racism. Remember, not passive. I'm not racist. I promise I'm not. I'm a good person. I'm a nice person. Has nothing to do with that. But actively working to eliminate racism, what that can possibly look like in our field. So I'm going to go through each one of these. The first being distinguishing anti-racism from not racist. I cannot say that enough. It can actually be a paradigm shift if you move from thinking that you are not racist just because you said you weren't and you are nice. So moving from a place, when was the last time I did something, to eliminate racism, because that is anti-racism. It is an active process. It is personal and it looks different for every person. Not racist is passive. It's more about your ego versus actively doing something. So shifting those beliefs, focusing on your actions and the impact you have on others. So how do you really know if you're anti-racist? If someone tells you you are. So a lot of times we have to remember this intention and impact. If we actually, I did that so wrong. I'm so sorry. I'm not very good with greater or less than or math. It's supposed to say, it's supposed to say impact eating intention, because the impact of what you do, you can have very good intentions, but if it impacts someone in a harmful way, then it is your work to reconcile, to rectify the situation. That is your work to do. So it's actually impact over intention. It is great to have good intentions, but how do you make people feel? What would your client say? Would your client say that, oh yeah, I definitely believe that they are an anti-racist provider, or not? That's the only way you can tell. That's why we kind of move from those terms like ally, because people were calling themselves ally. And instead, you can be a co-conspirator. You can try to join in, but only a community can call you that. So just thinking about those actions. The next point is using cultural humility as a personal norm. I love using cultural humility as a way to not only guide my teaching, to guide my practice, but quite frankly, to guide my life, because it is a commitment to learning, to listening to those podcasts, to reading those books, to being open-minded, to showing up to webinars like this in your free time, and also learning from your clients, learning from your colleagues' experiences, learning from community experiences. So that combination of learning about and learning from, also constant, moment to moment self-reflection on your biases, your privileges, your identities, focusing on building partnerships that are mutually beneficial, not just beneficial to you, especially for racially marginalized groups, and also considering intersectionality, that race compounds all experiences of oppression. It makes it worse the darker skin that you have, and working towards anti-racism in the institutions you are a part of. For the next point, I have a lot of reflection questions. I'm not going to read all of them, but I want you to do some reflection to explore your relationship with anti-Blackness. And you can explore that relationship in a couple of categories. In the first, in your beliefs and ideologies. Do you see the humanity of Black folks? Is Blackness, Black language, Black expression, or Black culture uncomfortable or unfamiliar to you? Do you have a problem saying the word Black? Do you feel uncomfortable? Some people do. Do you believe speech language practices are colorblind or color evasive? Do you find yourself saying, I treat all my clients the same? That is color evasive. So that is not affirming to someone who is racially marginalized. Also, thinking about your assessment, do you compare your Black clients' performance to white norms and expectations? Do you use assessment materials and practices that draw on the strengths of your Black clients? You can also reflect in your treatment practices. Do your Black clients see themselves positively in your materials and activities? Do you actively work to disrupt racism in your therapeutic relationships with Black clients, and also in your professional relationships? Do you build professional relationships with Black colleagues? Do you take accountability and work to reduce racial microaggressions with your Black colleagues? Do you depend on Black colleagues to teach you about Black languaging and lived experiences to support your practice? Those are just some reflection questions. Do you support organizations that are pro-Black, such as the National Black Association of Speech, Language, and Hearing? Would you find yourself in a room of Black educators or Black experts and take a back seat and listen and lean in and lean into discomfort? So those are just some things that you can reflect on your anti-racist journey. And remember, I am saying Black a lot. I am talking about Black people because uprooting racism, a lot of it has so much to do with really exploring anti-Blackness and how that shows up in our practice. But of course, we are always considering intersectionality. We always are considering every other racial identity as well. When it comes to addressing racism as a social determinant of health, we want to work to diversify our profession by supporting those organizations who are recruiting, who are retaining minoritized professionals. We want to engage in as much professional education as we can, like you showing up here today. Also, patient-centered care or anti-racist care has to do with addressing racism and committing to cultural humility in your therapeutic relationships. Reviewing policies and practices and a climate through the anti-racist lens, such as an anti-racist audit or a racial equity action assessment, which is a type of research assessment where you can look at, let's say, an environment, you can look at learning outcomes, student experiences, faculty experiences, even experiences in a entity like a private practice, and then you look at those results and you use the lens of anti-racism to take action. That is one example. Also getting engaged with racially minoritized communities by financially supporting businesses, joining organizations, serving in organizations, and continued learning, community participatory research, doing research alongside those communities, and advocacy. And finally, engaging in radical racial healing is the final strategy. Racism is harmful to all of us. It is a culture of disconnection and it lives in our bodies. It is a traumatic experience to be an oppressor and also to be oppressed. So ultimately, when you exist in systems that racism is inherent, healing is going to be necessary. And racial healing repairs the damage caused by racism. It is a traumatic experience that lives in our body, and these are some of the things that we can do to heal. We can build trusting relationships with each other, especially interracial relationships, whether those are work relationships or even professional relationships where you are asking someone, hey, I want to be held accountable. Having those relationships be organic, safe learning spaces for you. I think I have healed tremendously from racial trauma that I experienced growing up, just in relationship with some of my white colleagues who are committed to being co-conspirators in anti-racism. Also, there are other things like deep listening, journaling. I put on the book recommendations. The Racial Healing Journal is an excellent book, and it is actually written by therapists. Joining organizations and groups, racial healing therapy, those are just some options. And I made it to the last slide with 1 minute to spare. So I'm going to stop sharing. I would love to know your thoughts. I hope this wasn't an overwhelming amount of information, but maybe just something to get you thinking and get you started on your journey or wherever you are. Please look at those resources in the Google Drive. There is a handout for some of the slides, as well as just lots of resources for you. So any questions, comments?